The city was a maze of shadows and light, the kind of place that swallows you whole if you're not careful. The streets were teeming with people, those rushing to work, those trying to forget their lives, and those trying to survive the day. But somewhere, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city, an old man sat in the darkened alley, staring at the crumpled bills in his hand. His eyes, sharp and calculating despite the dirt and grime on his face, scanned his surroundings with the precision of someone who had seen much darker corners of the world. Victor Hayes hadn't always been a homeless man. Years ago, he had been a highly trained CIA assassin, a man whose job was to infiltrate, destroy, and erase anyone deemed a threat to national security. He was an expert in silent takedowns, a shadow in the night who left no trace, a ghost who vanished without a trace after completing his mission. But after a mission went wrong, after his cover was blown and his world collapsed, Victor was left behind, erased from the system, disavowed by the very people he had once worked for. He had spent the last 5 years living in the shadows, blending into the streets, hiding in plain sight. His once pristine military jackets and CIA-issued weapons were long gone, replaced by worn clothing and a beard that had grown thick from neglect. He had no name anymore, no identity, just a man with a past he could never outrun, a past he had been forced to leave behind. But his past was about to come crashing back into his life. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. The familiar sound of footsteps echoed in the alley. 4 men, heavily armed, moved quickly, their boots slamming against the cracked pavement as they approached. They weren't the usual drunks or beggars that wandered these streets. These men moved with purpose. They were mercenaries, hired guns, the kind of people who didn't care about the law or right and wrong. Their only job was to eliminate anyone their clients didn't want alive. Victor had been around long enough to know what was coming. He could smell trouble, and it was approaching fast. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink as the men drew closer, their steps deliberate and confident. They were here for him. He didn't know why, not yet, but he knew enough to be certain of it. The leader of the group, a man named Captain Kane, stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "Hey, old man, we need to have a little chat," he said, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "We know who you are. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Victor stayed silent, his eyes narrowing slightly. They knew who he was, and they had come for him. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Kane took another step closer, the others flanking him. The air between them was thick with tension, but Victor didn't move. He didn't need to. The mercenaries were too focused on him to notice the subtle movements of his body, the way his fingers twitched, the way his legs were poised, ready to spring into action. They assumed he was just another victim, a frail, helpless man they could overpower with ease. But they were wrong. Without warning, Victor struck. His fist was a blur as he slammed into the nearest man, a hard right hook that sent him crashing to the ground. The other mercenaries had barely started to react when Victor was already moving again, ducking low and sweeping the legs of the second man out from under him. The third man reached for his gun, but before he could pull it from his holster, Victor had already disarmed him, twisting his wrist in a way that made him drop the weapon with a scream. Captain Kane staggered back, eyes wide with disbelief. This wasn't the old man they thought they could overpower. "What the hell?" Kane spat, his hand now on the gun at his hip. He had been trained in the art of combat, but this wasn't what he had expected. He had thought they were hunting a broken man, someone easily disposed of. But the man in front of him was moving like a ghost, quicker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Victor barely gave Kane a chance to raise his weapon. He had already closed the distance, his fist punching Kane in the gut, sending the mercenary stumbling backward, gasping for breath. Before Kane could recover, Victor was on him, his elbow driving into Kane's ribcage with a sickening crack. The other mercenaries, now down and groaning in pain, scrambled to get back on their feet, but they were outclassed. Victor was faster, more efficient, and above all, deadly. Within moments, the alley was filled with unconscious men, their weapons scattered across the pavement. Victor stood over them, his breathing steady, his face as calm as it had been before the attack began. He looked down at Kane, who was struggling to rise, clutching his ribs. "You came here thinking I was an easy target," Victor said, his voice low and menacing. You thought I was just another homeless man. But you made a mistake. You've crossed the wrong person." Kane's eyes flickered with fear as he slowly realized the truth. The old man wasn't just some helpless civilian. He was someone far more dangerous. Someone who had been trained to kill, and he was no longer running. Victor looked down at the fallen mercenaries, his expression cold. "Get up," he said to Kane, his eyes narrowing. "You tell your bosses, whoever sent you, that I'm not a ghost. I'm not someone you can just sweep under the rug. If they want me, they're going to have to come for me themselves, and I'll be waiting." Kane didn't respond. He couldn't. His breath was shallow, his face pale. Victor turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy against the quiet street, leaving behind the mercenaries he had just defeated, men who thought they could kill him, but had only proven that they were the ones who were outmatched. As Victor walked into the night, the weight of his past threatened to come crashing back. These mercenaries were just the beginning. The people who had disavowed him were watching, waiting, and soon they would come. But Victor didn't fear them. He was ready. Victor walked briskly down the dimly lit street, his senses heightened, feeling the city's pulse beneath his feet. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but it wasn't the same kind of rush he used to get when he was on a mission. This was different. This wasn't about a clean kill or a covert operation. This was about survival, his survival. The mercenaries, while a nuisance, were nothing compared to the ghosts he had left behind. The old life, the one where he operated in the shadows of the CIA, felt like a distant memory now. But the fight he had just fought, the sudden shift in the city's quiet rhythm, made him realize that it would never truly be behind him. He would always be someone the world tried to erase, a weapon they couldn't control. Victor's eyes scanned the buildings around him, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets, his mind calculating his next move. The mercenaries, though tough, were nothing more than pawns in a game that was far bigger than them. They didn't know who he was, and they would soon realize that they had made a fatal mistake by trying to eliminate him. He stopped briefly to light a cigarette, the orange glow illuminating his face for a moment as he took a long drag. The smoke curled around him, dissipating into the chilly night air. They'd be back. They always came back. They were just the beginning of something more, and he needed to be ready. The thing about being disavowed by the CIA was that it didn't erase who he was. It didn't take away the skills that had been drilled into him over years of training. Those skills were his. They were the only things that had kept him alive, and they were what would get him through whatever came next. As he flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot, Victor's phone buzzed. He didn't need to check the caller ID to know who it was. His old handler, Elias, still had a way of tracking him. They were the ones who had erased him from the system, who had turned their backs on him after the mission had gone south. But there was always a part of the CIA that didn't truly let go. And Elias was a part of that world, the kind of man who had no loyalty to anyone but the job, and he knew how to get things done. Victor answered, his voice steady but cold. "Elias?" "Victor." The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. "You've made a mess. A group of mercenaries were dispatched to clean up your situation. I assume you know this." "I took care of them," Victor replied, his eyes scanning the streets around him. "They won't be a problem." Elias was silent for a moment, and Victor could hear the faint sound of papers rustling in the background. "That's not what I'm worried about. You've attracted attention, Victor. I warned you that coming back would be a problem. This wasn't part of the plan." Victor's jaw tightened. The plan? The CIA never had a plan for someone like him. They used him, broke him, and then tossed him aside. There was no plan for a man who had seen too much, a man who had carried out too many dirty operations. "I don't work for you anymore," he said flatly. "I'm not part of your plan." "Listen to me carefully," Elias continued, his voice lowering. "You're still a liability. Do you understand? You may think you've escaped, but you've never been free. There are people who will come for you, people you can't fight. They've sent those mercenaries for a reason, and they will not stop." Victor paused, his breath visible in the cold air. He could feel the old tension in his body, the sense that he was once again being hunted. "Who are they?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I can't give you details, but you don't want to find out. You need to stay off the grid, Victor. Keep your head down. They'll use whatever means necessary to neutralize you. You're not untouchable." The weight of the words hung heavy between them. Victor's gaze shifted to a nearby alley, his instincts kicking in. He wasn't untouchable, but he wasn't going down without a fight either. "I'll handle it," Victor said, his voice calm but laced with danger. "You've lost control of me, Elias. Don't forget that." Before Elias could respond, Victor hung up the phone and slipped it into his pocket. He knew he was no longer a pawn, but a target, and now he had to operate as if every move he made was being watched. He would have to go on the offensive. Victor's hand went to his coat pocket, where he kept the old CIA issue knife that had seen more blood than he cared to count. His fingers traced the worn handle, the cold steel, a reminder of the past he could never escape. But that didn't matter anymore. What mattered was surviving long enough to take down those who thought they could control him. They had underestimated him once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The days that followed were a blur of planning, preparation, and careful movement. Victor knew the streets like the back of his hand, where to hide, where to disappear, where to wait for the next move. He avoided crowds, used back alleys, and kept to places he knew were off the radar. But as the days wore on, the feeling that he was being tracked never left. He felt the cold stare of his enemies in every darkened corner, the silent steps of someone following too closely. He kept his face hidden, using scarves and hats to cover his identity. But it wasn't enough. He knew the CIA had resources, and there was no way they'd stop looking for him. They couldn't afford to let him live, especially after everything he knew. His knowledge could bring them all down, and they would stop at nothing to ensure he was silenced. Victor was prepared. He had to be. But as the hours ticked by and the weight of the threat closed in on him, he couldn't help but wonder, who would he be if the world finally caught up with him? Would he die as a forgotten man, or would he go down in flames, taking everyone who had wronged him with him? As the night fell over the city, Victor found himself once again in the shadows, watching the streets below from a rooftop, his eyes scanning the darkness. He had no intention of going down without a fight. He was ready for whatever came next, and when they came for him, he would make sure they regretted it. But the night was still young, and he knew the most dangerous part of his life was just about to begin. Victor's footsteps echoed in the alley, a steady rhythm that blended with the hum of the city around him. The night had grown colder, the wind biting at his skin, but he didn't feel it. He couldn't afford to. His mind was sharp, calculating every step, every decision. He had learned long ago that in his line of work, hesitation meant death. He had found a new hideout, a crumbling warehouse on the edge of the city, the kind of place no one paid attention to, tucked away behind a row of abandoned buildings. It wasn't much, but it was secure. No one knew he was here, at least that's what he told himself. Inside, the dim light from a single bulb illuminated a few crates stacked in the corner. The space smelled like old wood and rust, a faint odor of mold in the air. But it was the perfect place to lay low, to plan his next move. He had no intention of running forever. Running wasn't an option. He needed answers. He needed to know who was still pulling the strings and why they'd come after him. Sitting on an old crate, Victor pulled out a map of the city. His fingers traced the streets, the alleyways, the spots where he knew surveillance would be tight. The CIA had eyes everywhere. If they wanted to find him, they could. But they had underestimated him once. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was hunting. His phone buzzed again. He didn't need to check the number to know it was Elias, his old handler, the man who had once controlled his life, the one who had erased him when he had outlived his usefulness. "Victor," Elias's voice crackled through the speaker, "I didn't think you'd last this long." Victor's eyes narrowed as he leaned back against the crate. "I'm not some expendable asset, Elias. Not anymore." Elias chuckled, a dry, hollow sound. "You think you can run forever? The people behind this, they're not going to stop. They know who you are, what you know. You're a liability, Victor. They'll use everything they can to find you." Victor stood up, the map still in his hands, his jaw tightening. "I'm not running, Elias. I'm coming for them. And I'm starting with the people you sold me out to." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Elias spoke again, his voice had lost its usual confidence. "Victor, don't do this. I'm telling you, you're walking into a trap. If they find you, they're already looking for me," Victor cut in, his voice steady. "And when I find them, I'll make sure they wish they never came for me." The call ended abruptly, but Victor wasn't surprised. He'd known the conversation wouldn't go anywhere. Elias was a man of convenience. He would do whatever was necessary to protect himself. He wouldn't help Victor, not when the stakes were so high. But it didn't matter. Victor had always been a man of action, not words. The CIA had discarded him when they no longer had any use for him, but now it was his turn to settle the score. The next morning, Victor set out to gather information. He knew the city's underbelly like the back of his hand. He knew where to find the people who had the answers he needed: informants, street rats, anyone who could point him in the right direction. He moved through the crowds with a purpose, his face covered by a hood, his posture a little hunched to avoid drawing attention. The world had moved on from the man he used to be, and he had to move just as silently now as he had in his days as an operative. In a small, dingy bar tucked away on the edge of town, Victor found what he was looking for. A man named Johnny, a former CIA analyst who had been left to rot after his own betrayal. Johnny wasn't a threat, but he knew things. He had connections, a web of informants that could bring the right people together. For the right price, Johnny could provide the information Victor needed, and Victor was more than willing to pay. Johnny was sitting at a table in the corner, nursing a drink. His eyes flicked up when Victor approached, but he didn't flinch. Johnny had seen his kind before, men who had been discarded, men who had outlived their usefulness. "You look like you've been through hell," Johnny said, his voice rough, his lips curling into a half smile. "I have," Victor replied, pulling out a chair and sitting down. "And I'm looking for answers." Johnny leaned back, eyeing him carefully. "You got the wrong people chasing you, man. Those folks, they don't forget. Once they get a target in their sights, they don't stop." Victor's eyes narrowed. "I don't plan on being anyone's target for much longer. I need to know who sent those mercenaries after me, and I need to know what they want." Johnny let out a long sigh, his eyes darting around the bar, as if to make sure no one was listening. After a long moment, he leaned in closer. "I don't know their names, but I know who they work for. They're a private group, people with deep pockets, powerful connections. They're tied to the agency, but they're not official. Think of them as the shadow that operates behind the scenes, pulling strings when the CIA wants to keep their hands clean." Victor didn't flinch. This wasn't new information. He had known that much already, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. It meant there were people out there, people more dangerous than he had ever imagined, who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. "They want me dead because I know too much," Victor said softly. "But I can't let them silence me. Not this time." Johnny looked over his shoulder again, his gaze lingering on the door. "I'm telling you, Victor, you don't want to get involved in this. These people have money, they have resources, and they'll make you disappear without a second thought. You're already a ghost, but they'll make sure you stay that way." Victor stood up, his movements swift and deliberate. He wasn't here for advice, and he didn't need anyone's pity. He was done hiding. "I appreciate the heads up, Johnny," he said, "but I'm not going to let them keep me in the dark. If they want me, they'll have to come for me, and when they do, I'll be ready." Victor tossed a few bills onto the table before turning to leave, his mind already calculating his next move. He had what he needed: a name, a lead, and the understanding that his past wasn't something he could outrun anymore. The time for hiding was over. The city may have thought he was just another homeless man, someone easy to forget, but the truth was far from that. He had been a weapon, trained to survive, to eliminate, to fight. And if they thought they could use him and cast him aside, they were about to learn the hard way that Victor Hayes was not someone who would stay forgotten. Victor spent the next few days preparing. Every waking moment was consumed with thought, calculation, and action. He couldn't afford to waste time. His enemies were out there, tracking his every move, but they had no idea that he was already one step ahead. He knew they would send more mercenaries, maybe even more dangerous ones. The question wasn't whether they would come, it was how fast they would arrive, and when they did, he'd be ready. Victor's days were spent moving in and out of shadowed alleys, slipping through the crowds without drawing attention. He wasn't just hiding, he was planning. The old man who had once been discarded by the CIA, erased from their files, was still alive, and that made him more dangerous than anyone realized. The skills he had learned during his time as an assassin were still sharp, honed by years of survival in the streets. But now he was using them for something more than just survival. The night air was thick with the scent of rain as he moved through the abandoned warehouse district, his eyes scanning the shadows. His mind was calm, but his body was always alert, every muscle ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. He had set traps, hidden weapons, and already anticipated where they would make their first move. The city was full of places they could catch him off guard, but Victor knew better. He wasn't going to be the one hunted. Hours later, just as the city lights began to fade under the thick clouds of the coming storm, he received the call. He didn't need to check the number to know who it was. It was Elias, the man who had once controlled his life, pulling the strings in the shadows. But now, Victor was the one in control. He listened to the phone ring for a moment, the weight of his past pressing against him. "Victor?" Elias's voice crackled over the line, tight with tension. "You need to stop this. It's not too late. There's no need to make things worse." Victor chuckled softly, his breath a cloud in the cool night air. "Worse? Elias, you know what worse looks like. I've been to the edge, stared into it, but I'm not running anymore. I'm finishing this." "You don't understand what's coming," Elias said, his voice low, almost pleading now. "You think you're still in control, but you're walking into something bigger than you can handle. They won't stop until you're dead. And when they come for you, there's nothing I can do. Nothing anyone can do." Victor's eyes narrowed as he stopped walking, his shadow stretching across the wet pavement. "You think I don't know that? I didn't ask for any of this, Elias. I didn't ask to be erased, to be thrown away. But here we are. And now, I'm going to make sure they never forget me. You tell your people that." He ended the call, the buzz in his ears drowned by the sound of the rain beginning to pour harder. He didn't need Elias's warnings. What he needed was action. He had learned one thing in his years as an operative. No one could control him unless he allowed it, and he wasn't going to let them control him now. Victor's next move was to find the people responsible. He needed answers, not just about why the CIA had decided to disavow him, but about who had been pulling the strings from the very beginning. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, about forcing the agency to acknowledge the man they had abandoned. He knew where to go. The old safe house on the edge of the city was the first stop, a place where he had once worked with other agents, long before everything fell apart. The people who frequented this location were either long gone or too deep in the system to help him now. But there were always loose ends, and Victor was an expert at finding them. As he entered the safe house, memories came rushing back, the sound of distant voices, the secretive conversations, the tension that always hung in the air. It had been years since he'd been here, but the place hadn't changed much. The walls were still lined with old files, the cabinets still locked tight. But Victor knew better than to trust the system. He pulled out a small set of tools, expertly working the locks until they gave way. Inside, he found what he needed: files, old documents, the kind that weren't supposed to exist anymore. As he flipped through the papers, a name caught his attention: Douglas Holden. The name was familiar, too familiar. He had crossed paths with Holden during a mission years ago. Holden had been a handler, someone deeply embedded within the agency. He had been part of the operation that led to Victor's disavowal, the operation that had gone wrong. Victor's fingers tightened around the folder as he read further. Holden had been the architect of the mission that had gotten Victor branded as a liability. And now, it seemed Holden had gone rogue, working outside the system, pulling strings for people with even more power than the CIA. The storm raged outside as Victor stood in the middle of the safe house, the files spread out in front of him. Holden was the key. If Victor could find him, he could finally get answers, finally bring this entire operation into the light. But it wouldn't be easy. Holden had spent years building connections, hiding in plain sight. And the mercenaries, the ones who had already come for him, were just a taste of the forces Holden had at his disposal. Victor's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't Elias. This time it was something worse. A message, encrypted and short. "We know you're still alive. We're coming for you. This time, we finish it." Victor didn't hesitate. He had spent too many years being the one hunted. Now, he was the hunter, and he wouldn't stop until the job was done. He grabbed his gear, slinging the bag over his shoulder. The storm had reached its peak, the winds howling outside. But Victor wasn't worried. The night was his ally, and he knew exactly where to go next. As he left the safe house, He felt the weight of the mission settle on him like a familiar burden. He had walked this path before, had done the impossible, had killed when it was necessary. But this time was different. This wasn't just a mission. It was personal. And when it was over, he wasn't just going to disappear again. This time, the CIA and everyone behind it would know exactly who Victor Hayes was. He walked into the storm, ready to face whatever was coming, knowing that this time there would be no escape for anyone who dared to get in his way. Victor's heart beat steadily as he moved through the storm, the wind whipping against his face, biting at his exposed skin. The city was a blur of neon lights and rain-slick streets, but his focus was razor sharp. He had no time for distractions, no time to second-guess his actions. The message he'd received, the one that had been brief but full of threat, was just another reminder of the world he was walking into. They knew he was alive, and they were closing in. It was clear. The time for waiting was over. He turned down a narrow side street, the shadows playing tricks on his tired eyes. He didn't mind the rain. It was familiar, soothing in its own way, like a mask for the things he had to do. The scent of wet asphalt and the distant hum of city traffic filled the air, but underneath it all was a deeper, more insidious presence. The knowledge that his past had finally caught up to him, and they would stop at nothing to see him erased. Victor's fingers tightened around the handle of his bag, the weight of his old weapons and tools inside a reminder of what he was capable of. But this wasn't about just surviving. This was about going on the offensive, going after the people who had turned their backs on him, who had sold him out like a disposable asset. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. His target now was Douglas Holden, the man who had orchestrated Victor's downfall years ago. He was the one who had pulled the strings from the shadows, manipulating events that led to Victor's disavowal, watching as the CIA cast him aside and erased every trace of his existence. It was Holden's decision that had cost Victor everything, and now Victor would make him pay. He arrived at the nondescript building, a high-rise that looked as though it could have been any office building in the city. But Victor knew better. This wasn't a place where the general public came. It was a fortress for the kind of people who operated in the unseen parts of the world, where government contracts were signed and dirty deals were made. He stood outside for a moment, his breath fogging in the cool night air, before slipping through the alley that ran alongside the building. The entrance was hidden, like most places of its kind. Victor had been here before, years ago when he was still part of the operation. He knew the layout, the security systems, and the routines of the men who worked here. He moved swiftly, silently, his steps barely making a sound as he approached the back door. His mind worked through the plan in seconds, visualizing every move. Victor slid his hand into his pocket, pulling out a small device, a lockpick that had been a staple of his trade for years. He set to work, the metal clicking softly as he turned the tumblers. It only took a few seconds before the door gave way with a faint groan. He slipped inside without hesitation, his eyes quickly adjusting to the dim light. The building was quiet, the only sounds coming from the low hum of machinery and the faint murmurs of distant voices. He moved through the hallways like a shadow, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He had no room for mistakes, no time for hesitation. Douglas Holden was just a few floors above him, hidden behind layers of security and protective guards. But that wouldn't matter. It never did. Not when Victor was in control. He bypassed the security system with ease, his experience allowing him to slip past unnoticed. It wasn't arrogance, it was just the reality of his training. He knew how to move, how to blend in, how to make himself invisible. He'd spent years becoming a ghost in a world that demanded men like him to disappear. It didn't take long before Victor reached the elevator that would take him up to the top floor. He pressed the button and waited, his fingers tapping against the worn fabric of his jacket. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, adjusting his posture. The elevator ascended slowly, the hum of the machinery the only sound in the enclosed space. When the elevator reached its destination, the doors opened to a sleek, minimalist lobby. The space was sterile, cold, but the luxury was evident. This was where the people who controlled the fate of nations hid, where men like Holden worked in secrecy, pulling the strings of operations that shaped the world. The walls were lined with modern art, expensive and meaningless to someone like Victor. To him, this was just a facade, a place where secrets were buried and lies were born. Victor stepped out of the elevator, his eyes scanning the room, his mind already assessing the layout. He knew that Holden's office was at the end of the hallway. But there were guards, 2 men standing watch outside, probably armed and ready for trouble. But Victor wasn't worried. He had spent years taking down men like them, men who thought they were untouchable, who believed they were safe in their little worlds. He moved swiftly, using the shadows to his advantage. One guard, a man in his 30s, walked toward him, his gun slung loosely at his side. Victor didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, grabbing the guard by the throat and pulling him into the shadows before the man could react. A quick, precise strike to the neck left him unconscious, his body limp in Victor's arms. He gently lowered him to the ground, making sure to keep the noise to a minimum. The second guard, now aware that something was wrong, started to move toward the door. But before he could raise the alarm, Victor was on him. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it, and with a well-placed knee to the stomach, sent him crashing to the floor. He didn't bother with words. There was no need. The guards were out cold, and the only thing left was the final confrontation. Victor approached the door to Holden's office, his heart beating steadily in his chest. He didn't feel fear. He never did. It wasn't a part of him anymore. Fear was for those who had something to lose. Victor had already lost everything. Now, it was time to take what was his. He kicked the door open, the sound of the wood splintering filling the otherwise silent room. Inside, Douglas Holden sat behind a massive desk, a drink in his hand. The moment he saw Victor, he froze, his face going pale. His hand trembled as he set the drink down. "I should have known you'd come for me, Victor," Holden said, his voice shaky. "But you're making a mistake. You don't understand what you're getting into." Victor didn't respond. His hand slid into his jacket, and the sound of the snapping blade filled the air as he drew his knife. He took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Holden's. "You should have never crossed me," Victor said, his voice cold and unyielding. "I was never meant to be your pawn. And now, you'll understand what happens when you underestimate me." Holden's eyes darted to the door, to the desk, to the possible escape routes, but he knew there was no way out, not this time. Victor didn't need to say anything more. His actions would do the talking. He stepped closer, his knife gleaming under the soft office lights. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and Holden was about to learn just how far Victor Hayes was willing to go to reclaim his life. Victor walked away from Holden, his footsteps echoing in the quiet office as he processed the gravity of what had just been revealed. The weight of the knowledge was crushing, suffocating. Yet there was a part of him that felt a strange sense of clarity. The world he had once known, the world that had discarded him, was nothing like what he had imagined. The Cabal, an organization so deeply entrenched in power that it controlled the world from the shadows. It wasn't just about taking down a few rogue agents anymore. This was the fight for something far bigger than his personal vendetta. It was about exposing the darkness that had shaped everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed. He stood still for a moment, his breath slow and steady, gathering his thoughts. He had the lead now, a name that tied everything together. The Cabal. He could almost feel the weight of their eyes on him, the way they would move to eliminate him once they realized what he knew. It would be a race against time now. He couldn't afford to waste a second. Victor walked towards the door of Holden's office, pushing the heavy metal door open with a single shove. The building was quiet, almost eerily so, and for a moment he thought he could hear his heartbeat above the hum of the machinery. Every corner, every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The CIA had already done its worst to him, and the Cabal was just another layer of deception to strip away. He was beyond fear. He had already been broken once, and now he was unshakable. The first step was to make sure that Holden didn't make it out alive. He had to silence him completely. The man had revealed everything he needed to know, but Holden was a liability. No one left the game alive unless Victor said so. Victor moved quickly, silently, back down the hallway. He passed the 2 unconscious guards in the lobby, their bodies sprawled on the floor where he had left them, still knocked out cold from the fight earlier. He paused by the elevator, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was thick now, almost suffocating. He could feel the tension of the moment wrapping around him, but he pushed it aside. He had work to do. As he reached the parking garage, the sound of his boots against the concrete seemed unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent space. His eyes flicked to the exits, to the cars parked along the walls. The only way out of here was through the front doors or the back, but Victor knew the front would be too risky. They'd be waiting for him there. He needed to disappear, fast. The sound of a phone ringing broke through his thoughts. He pulled it from his jacket pocket and glanced at the screen. It was Elias again. The old handler had been persistent, but Victor wasn't interested in more of his warnings. He had outlived every person who had once held power over him. He was done taking orders. This was his fight now. He tapped the screen, answering the call but remaining silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of Elias's breathing on the other end. Then Elias spoke, his voice tight with urgency. "You think this is over?" Elias asked, his tone not as confident as before. "You're walking into something you can't control. They're already mobilizing. They'll come for you harder than you know." Victor's gaze narrowed as he walked past rows of cars, his mind already 3 steps ahead. "You should have known better, Elias. I'm not going anywhere, not until I've finished this." There was a long pause, the silence hanging between them like a suffocating fog. When Elias spoke again, his voice was tinged with resignation. "I'm not going to beg you to stop, Victor. I can't protect you from them. No one can. They'll tear you apart." Victor's lips curled into a faint smile, though there was no humor in it. "I'm already torn apart. That's why I'm still alive. I'm done hiding in the shadows. The CIA, the cabal, they think they can control me. They can't. They'll understand soon enough." He ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His grip tightened around the knife, still tucked into his belt, and his eyes scanned the garage again, methodical and unyielding. He wasn't running anymore. Now, the game had changed. He would make them come to him. The following days blurred into one continuous stream of movement and preparation. Victor had already set his plan in motion, using every resource at his disposal to track down the cabal's remaining ties. He knew they would be scrambling, trying to erase every trace of him. But he had the advantage now. They didn't know what he was capable of. They didn't realize they had awoken a sleeping monster. He gathered his tools and weapons, careful to stay under the radar. He moved through the city in the dead of night, blending in with the crowds, slipping unnoticed into shadows. The world he had once been a part of was no longer his reality. He had burned those bridges long ago, but now he was prepared to burn down the entire structure. His target was a warehouse on the edge of the city, a place where the cabal had made their first mistake. They had underestimated him. He had traced their operations here, piecing together the scattered information he had gathered. This would be the place where it all came to a head. Victor didn't need to worry about the mercenaries this time. They were no longer the real threat. It was the people behind them, the real architects of his misery, the ones who thought they could control his fate. He had walked into their trap once before, but now he would be the one to set the trap for them. The warehouse loomed in front of him, its walls grim and unwelcoming. The sound of his boots against the wet pavement was the only noise in the dead of night. He paused outside the gates, taking a deep breath. There was no turning back now. Inside, the cabal's men were waiting, but Victor was already inside their heads. He had studied their patterns, their routines, their weaknesses. And when they thought they had him cornered, when they thought they could finish what they started, he would make sure they realized too late that Victor Hayes was no longer a name to be forgotten. He slipped through a gap in the fence and moved towards the entrance, his movements silent, precise. He knew where the primary control room was located, and he had already planned how to disable the security. He didn't need the cameras or alarms. He could handle it without them. The door creaked as he pushed it open, his senses immediately on alert. He moved through the shadows, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, prepared for anything. They would be coming for him soon. But this time, he wasn't alone. Victor was no longer just a man on the run. He was a force, and the people who had tried to erase him would soon learn what it meant to make Victor Hayes an enemy. Victor's pulse was steady as he moved deeper into the warehouse, his body trained to be as silent as the night air. The dim light from a single flickering bulb overhead cast long shadows across the concrete floor, illuminating only fragments of the expansive space. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere in the distance, but they were far too slow, far too scattered. They hadn't realized yet that they were already trapped. Victor's eyes flicked from shadow to shadow, taking in the layout with practiced precision. His mind was sharp, calculating as he moved through the darkness with the kind of grace that only years of training could cultivate. The Cabal had no idea what they had been dealing with when they decided to come after him. They thought they could control the game, but he had already turned the tables. As he slipped behind a stack of crates, his fingers brushed the cold steel of his knife, the weapon that had been his constant companion during his years as a CIA operative. It was still as sharp as ever, ready to cut through the web of deception that had entangled him for too long. His mission was simple now: end them, all of them, and make sure they never got the chance to erase another person like him again. He paused for a moment, listening to the faint noises around him. There were people close. He could hear their muffled voices. The Cabal's men, the ones who had been protecting their secrets, weren't as careful as they thought. They were out of their element. They weren't used to being the ones hunted. They hadn't realized that the prey they had tried to bury had become the predator. Victor moved again, quieter now, slipping past the security checkpoint where two guards stood, oblivious to the man just a few feet away. He could have killed them, taken them out quietly, but he didn't need to. He wasn't here to make their deaths easy. He wasn't here to play by their rules anymore. At the far end of the warehouse, the main office stood, the last bastion of power in this place. Victor knew the man he was looking for was in there, the architect of everything. Douglas Holden had been the first piece, but now the Cabal's leaders were the ones who needed to be brought down. Victor crouched behind another row of crates, his eyes fixed on the office door. He could hear muffled voices inside, the low hum of conversation. The air smelled of rust and oil, but beneath it all was the unmistakable scent of fear. His fear, the fear that clung to him as he closed in on the final part of his mission. The last few weeks had been a blur of relentless pursuit. The nights blurred into each other as he hunted down the Cabal's operatives. One by one, he had dismantled their systems, cut off their support, and made them question their own safety. Each kill had been methodical, deliberate, sending a message to the Cabal. Victor Hayes was not to be underestimated. But this was the final act. This was where the game would end. Victor approached the door to the office, pausing just outside. He could hear their voices more clearly now, could make out snippets of their conversation. One of them, someone familiar, was speaking in a low, almost urgent tone. "He's still out there, you know," the voice said, and Victor's heart skipped a beat. It was Elias, his old handler. He'd been here all along, still pulling strings, still trying to control him. "We're not leaving until this is finished," Elias continued, his voice tense. "We've lost too much ground already. Victor can't be allowed to survive this. We need to eliminate him." Victor's grip tightened on the door handle, his breath steady. They had underestimated him once, and now they were all going to pay. He pushed the door open just a fraction, slipping inside with the kind of silent precision that came naturally. His eyes scanned the room. At the far end, Elias stood beside a man in a well-tailored suit, his back turned, facing a large window that overlooked the city. The man was older, his face worn but sharp, his demeanor one of authority. The head of the Cabal. Victor felt a cold smile tug at his lips. It was time. Before Elias or the other man could react, Victor moved. He crossed the room in a blur of motion, his body a shadow that blended with the darkness. The first man didn't even see him coming, falling to the floor with a sharp, quiet thud. Elias spun around, his eyes wide with shock, but it was too late. Victor was already there, faster than the fear that gripped his chest. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but Victor was already on him, grabbing him by the throat and lifting him off the ground. "You're not in control anymore, Elias," Victor said, his voice cold as ice. "I am?" Elias's face turned pale as he struggled, gasping for air. His hands clawed at Victor's grip, but it was useless. The power had shifted, and Elias knew it. He had underestimated Victor, just like everyone else. You don't know what you're doing," Elias wheezed, his eyes darting to the fallen man at his side. "The Cabal, there's no stopping them. They will." "Shut up!" Victor interrupted, tightening his grip just enough to cut off the rest of Elias's words. He could feel the man's pulse racing beneath his fingers, the last vestiges of life slipping away. Victor leaned in close, his breath hot against Elias's ear. "You made me a ghost, Elias. You erased me. And now, I'm going to erase everything you've worked for. No one gets away with using people like me." He let go of Elias's throat, and the man crumpled to the floor. Victor stood over him, watching as the life drained from his eyes, the last remnants of power slipping through his fingers. It was over. The Cabal had no more control over him. They had no more leverage. Victor had finally taken back what they had tried to steal from him. He looked over at the man in the suit, the head of the Cabal, who was now shaking, his hands raised in surrender. But there would be no mercy. Victor moved toward him, his footsteps echoing in the now silent room. "You thought you could control me," Victor said softly, his voice dripping with venom. "But you never had the power. You never had a chance." With a swift motion, he drew the knife from his belt. The man didn't even have time to scream. In a final decisive strike, Victor ended it. The leader of the Cabal fell, his body limp, a final breath escaping his lips. Victor stood over the two men, the weight of everything he had lost, everything he had fought for, settling over him. He had finally taken control. He had erased them, just as they had tried to erase him, and in doing so, he had freed himself. As the room fell silent, Victor allowed himself a single, deep breath. It was over. The game had come to an end, and he had won. Victor Hayes was no longer the man they had thrown away. He was a force to be reckoned with, and the world would never forget it.